Chapter 1. The Wycliffe Inheritance. Jane Parsons looked out the window of the motor, her keen eyes scanning the vast brooding estate before her called Larkspur House, so named for the vibrant flowers that lined its front lawn, an imposing structure of dark brick and ivy with tall windows. She had received a letter from Sir Wycliffe. In it he had requested a meeting, as he wanted her opinion on something, but on what he had failed to mention in that letter, and now cutting short her holiday, she was here in the country. As she stepped out on the gravel, the chill of the autumn air bit at her skin, reminding her of the task at hand. She had been briefed on the situation during her journey. Sir Edward Wycliffe, the family patriarch, had been found dead in his study, along with his wife, Lady Wycliffe. The circumstances of their deaths were highly suspicious. Both had shown no signs of struggle or injury, but the cause of death was not immediately apparent. Jane thought with regret how perhaps if she had received the letter earlier, these unfortunate deaths could have been avoided. "Miss Parsons," a voice called out, and Jane turned to see Inspector Collins, a stout man with a ruddy complexion, walking briskly toward her. His face was tight with concern, the lines around his mouth betraying his stress. "Thank you for coming. It's all a bit much, I'm afraid. The family is in a state of shock. They're not terribly helpful at the moment." "Perhaps we'll find a few answers of our own," Jane said, telling the inspector about the letter. The two made their way up the steps and into the grand hall of Larkspur House. The house had an air of faded grandeur, its once majestic furnishings now worn from years of neglect. Large portraits of the Wycliffe ancestors hung on the walls, their painted eyes seeming to watch Jane as she walked by. She had read a little about the Wycliffes, their wealth, their land, their prominence in local society. Sir Edward had built a fortune through a series of successful investments, while Lady Wycliffe had been a noted philanthropist, especially involved with charity work for children. Lady Wycliffe was, well, she was beloved, Collins continued as they ascended the stairs. Her death has hit the town hard. Sir Edward, not so much. He had his share of enemies. Some say he was ruthless when it came to his business dealings. Not everyone approved of the way he made his money. Jane nodded thoughtfully. Collins muttered, "But there's something else. Something odd." Sir Edward had been feeling unwell for the last few weeks. Nothing alarming, but he'd been taking certain medicines. The housekeeper claimed she'd seen a new batch of them arrive only a few days before he died. Jane's ears perked up. "Medicines? What sort of medicines?" "That's the part we don't know," Collins said grimly. "We've only just begun looking into it, but the family is all too eager to dismiss it as some sort of natural cause. Of course, it's not natural to have two people die at the same time, is it?" They stopped outside a large oak door at the end of a corridor. The room inside was dimly lit, but Jane could make out the outline of two bodies on the floor, Sir Edward and Lady Wycliffe, side by side, as if they had simply lain down for a nap. The air was thick with an unsettling stillness. There was no sign of a struggle, no overturned furniture, no broken glass. Nothing to indicate violence. Collins gave a sharp nod, and Jane stepped inside, her boots making no sound on the thick carpet. The two bodies were laid out in an almost serene fashion, but Jane knew better than to take appearances at face value. "Have the autopsies been completed?" she asked, bending slightly to examine the bodies more closely. "They've been started, but nothing conclusive yet," Collins replied. "Both appear to have died in the night, possibly at the same time. The coroner says there's no obvious trauma, and nothing to suggest suffocation or drowning." "Interesting." Jane moved closer to Sir Edward's body, her eyes narrowing slightly, as she noticed the faintest hint of discoloration on his lips and around his nails. She then moved to Lady Wycliffe, but her attention was fully on the peculiar scent that lingered in the air. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but unmistakable once recognized. The bitter, sharp tang of curare. "Inspector, has anyone considered poisoning?" she asked, her voice low. Collins blinked in surprise. "Poisoning? You mean like strychnine or something?" Jane shook her head. No, this is something rarer. Curare. Curare? The poison used in Africa? Yes, it's very slow-acting, but deadly nonetheless. It's a paralytic agent that can be introduced through ingestion or even absorbed through the skin. It's difficult to detect if the symptoms aren't caught immediately, and the victim can appear as if they simply fell asleep. Good Lord, Collins muttered. Jane straightened up and glanced at the two lifeless figures again, her mind already racing through possibilities. Curare is rare, but it's not unheard of. In the right hands, it can be used effectively to kill. And from what I know of Sir Edward's recent activities, there may be someone in this household with the means to procure it. Do you think it's one of the family? Collins asked, hinting at the letter Jane had showed him earlier. That's what we need to figure out, Jane replied. We must speak with the family immediately. But before we do, I'd like to examine the rest of the house. The staff, the servants, anyone who might know of the Wycliffe's habits or, she hesitated, who might have had access to something like curare. Collins looked at her, eyes narrowing with both curiosity and a trace of frustration. But that's not something they'll just admit, is it? Not something most people have lying around. Precisely, which is why we need to look carefully. Sometimes the answers are hidden in plain sight. The rest of the house unfolded before Jane like an intricate puzzle. She made a mental note of every detail, the distant ticking of a grandfather clock, the faint scent of roses in the air, the staff who seemed a little too busy to look her in the eye. But it was the small things that caught her attention. The way the butler, Mr. Miles, was ever so slightly nervous when asked about Sir Edward's recent medicines, and the strange way Beatrice, Sir Edward's daughter-in-law, had arrived early to the reading of the will, as if she knew something others did not. By the time Jane finished her initial tour of the house, one thing had become abundantly clear. This was no random act of death. The Wycliffe family's secrets were about to surface, and Jane Parsons was determined to unearth them, one careful step at a time. Chapter 2. The Bitter Elixir. Jane sat in the dimly lit drawing room, her fingers lightly tapping on the edge of the ornate chair where she had placed herself. Her mind replayed the scene in Sir Edward Wycliffe's study, the strange, unnerving stillness of the bodies, the faint odour that had hinted at curare poisoning, and the feeling that something far darker was at work. And as she had already surmised the night before, this was no random death. It was planned, carefully executed. It was now her task to uncover the who, the why, and most crucially, the how. Her first stop that morning had been the local apothecary, a small, charming shop just off the main village square. It was run by an elderly woman named Mrs. Hargrave, who had been in the business for decades. If curare had been smuggled into the region, Jane was certain that someone like Mrs. Hargrave would have seen something, or perhaps heard something. There's no question it's an exotic poison, my dear, Mrs. Hargrave had told her in a soft, measured voice, adjusting her spectacles as she leaned forward. Curare is very rare, you see. I've heard tell of it only once or twice over the years. It was most commonly used by explorers and traders coming back from Africa, where the indigenous people use it on their arrows. And would such a poison be available to people here in England? Jane had asked, her eyes studying the woman closely. Well, I suppose it's not impossible, Mrs. Hargrave replied with a small frown. I've heard of it being used by certain circles, if you take my meaning. There are chemists who travel, of course, who might bring it back. Or there are those who collect unusual substances, particularly for research purposes. She had paused, her gaze momentarily distant as if recalling a past event. But I haven't seen it around here for years. The only place it's been mentioned recently was in the papers, an African expedition from a few months ago. Would you know the name of the chemist who brought it back, perhaps? Jane asked. But Mrs. Hargrave shook her head slowly. I don't know, my dear. I only know rumours. The apothecary's shop had yielded no concrete information, but Jane had learned one thing. Curare, though rare, was not as inaccessible as one might think. The idea that someone with the right connections could procure it did not seem entirely out of the question. Now it was time to return to Larkspur House and turn her attention to those who lived there. The scent of freshly brewed tea filling the air as servants scurried about preparing for the day. The house seemed quieter than usual, the absence of Sir Edward and Lady Wycliffe casting a pall over its usual bustle. The three principal suspects, the Wycliffe heirs, were still reeling from the deaths. Jane knew from her previous conversation with Inspector Collins that none of them had been forthcoming with useful information, but it was time to talk to them again. She started with Beatrice Wycliffe, the sharp, calculating daughter-in-law of Sir Edward. Beatrice was a striking woman, tall and composed, her appearance as immaculate as her reputation. She was a woman of wealth, privilege, and social ambition, but Jane's instinct told her that her elegance concealed a much more dangerous edge. Beatrice was seated in the drawing-room when Jane entered. Her posture rigid, she greeted Jane with a smile that was far too polite, far too practiced. "Miss Parsons, I assume you are here to ask more questions about everything that has happened." Beatrice's voice was smooth, almost too smooth, the kind of voice that suggested both a desire for control and a fear of losing it. "Yes," Jane said, taking a seat. "It's a very tragic affair, Mrs. Wycliffe. I understand you were close to both Sir Edward and Lady Wycliffe." Beatrice's eyes flickered. "Of course. I've been married to Sir Edward's son, Hugh, for many years now. I've known Sir Edward since I was a young woman. We've always been close." Jane studied her carefully. "I understand that Sir Edward had recently made changes to his will. Do you know anything about those changes?" Beatrice's expression hardened for a moment before she regained her composure. "It's true. Sir Edward had decided to leave a large portion of his wealth to charity. We were all rather surprised by it. The Wycliffe fortune, after all, has always been a family legacy." "Was anyone particularly upset by these changes?" Jane asked. Beatrice's gaze flicked briefly to the door, as though ensuring they were not being overheard. "I think we were all a bit disappointed," she replied coolly. "But that's to be expected when a man of Sir Edward's age makes such decisions. He felt it was time for a change." Jane made a mental note of this. Beatrice's tone told her nothing useful, but it did suggest that her financial interest in the Wycliffe estate was not insignificant. "And what about the medicine Sir Edward was taking?" Jane asked. "Did you know what he had been prescribed?" Beatrice hesitated. Sir Edward was always a man who had to have something for every little ailment. He had a lot of ailments, sleeplessness, headaches, you name it. I suppose he was getting something new from his doctor, but I don't know the details, Miss Parsons. Jane studied her closely. "You didn't see any of the medicines yourself?" Beatrice's lips tightened, but she maintained eye contact. "I didn't take an interest in Sir Edward's medical matters. I trusted the staff to handle that." It was clear that Beatrice was withholding something, but Jane had no intention of confronting her just yet. She would return to Beatrice in time. Next, she turned her attention to Hugh Wycliffe, Sir Edward's estranged son. He had been away for several years, living abroad in India, and had only recently returned to England after a long absence. His relationship with his father had always been strained, but it seemed to have worsened in the last few months. From what Jane had gathered, Sir Edward and Hugh had had an argument just before Hugh left for India, and the rift had never fully healed. Hugh was in the study when Jane found him, standing near the window, staring out at the mist-laden grounds. He was a tall man, dark-haired with sharp features that betrayed the weight of years spent brooding over something. When he turned to face Jane, there was a coldness in his eyes, something of a man who had been wronged. "I suppose you want to ask me about my father," Hugh said, his voice bitter. "Yes, Mr. Wycliffe. I need to ask about your father's will. And of course, I need to ask about the deaths." "I was only just informed of my father's condition when I arrived home. I didn't expect him to be dead," Hugh said. "As for the will, I suppose you know that I had very little to do with it. My father made it clear that he wasn't interested in leaving me much. Did you know about his medicines? Jane asked, watching his reaction closely. Hugh stiffened. What are you implying, Miss Parsons? I'm simply asking if you knew what he had been taking, Jane said, her voice even. It's possible that these medicines played a role in his death. I don't know what my father was taking, Hugh replied stiffly. He was old, and he'd been unwell for months. I came home to find him changed, quiet, distant. It's not surprising he would die. As for the will, I had no part in it. I wasn't even consulted about it, but— He hesitated, his eyes darting to the door as if he were about to share something important. If I had inherited everything, I'd have changed things myself, but that's not relevant now, is it? Jane's eyes sharpened. No, it's not, she said quietly. Not yet, at least. Her next stop was to speak with Eliza Wycliffe, the quiet, reserved daughter of Sir Edward. But that would have to wait. There were more pressing questions that needed answers first. And Jane prepared to turn her attention elsewhere. She felt a deep certainty in her bones. This case was far from ordinary. Chapter 3. The Forged Will. The morning after her interview with Hugh Wycliffe, Jane found herself back in the dimly lit study of Larkspur House, her mind still preoccupied with the unusual circumstances of the deaths and the mysterious presence of Curare. Though she had gathered a few fragments of information from her conversations with Beatrice and Hugh, there was one question that lingered in her mind. The will. The revised will, which had been read to the family just days before Sir Edward's death, had been a point of contention among the heirs. Sir Edward, in his declining health, had made significant changes to his testament, cutting back on the inheritance for his wife and children, and leaving the majority of his fortune to various charitable causes. The family had been vocal in their displeasure, but Jane suspected that beneath their surface grief and confusion, there was more at play. Much more. The butler, Mr. Miles, had informed her that the solicitor who had drawn up the new will, Arthur Blake, was due to arrive that afternoon. Jane had already made her arrangements to meet with him, but before she spoke with the solicitor, Jane decided to take another look at the documents herself. The study was exactly as Jane remembered it, richly decorated with dark mahogany furniture and heavy velvet drapes that cast long shadows on the walls. Sir Edward's leather-bound bookshelves lined one wall, each book neatly arranged in perfect order, as though they had been catalogued by a man who demanded control over every aspect of his life. Yet there was one thing that stood out now. The desk where Sir Edward had conducted his business seemed almost untouched. The drawers, usually full of letters and papers, were all open and empty, except for a small stack of documents, some official-looking papers, and— Jane's eyes narrowed— 2 versions of Sir Edward's will. One will, the original, was clearly dated from several years ago. Jane skimmed through it quickly. It was straightforward, leaving the bulk of the estate to Lady Wycliffe and splitting the remainder between Hugh and Beatrice. Eliza, Sir Edward's daughter, had been left a small portion, enough to live comfortably, but not enough to challenge her brother and sister-in-law's position. But it was the second will that piqued Jane's interest. This was the one that had been drawn up just a few days before Sir Edward's death. Jane had already heard some details of it from Beatrice and Hugh, but seeing it with her own eyes sent a ripple of unease through her. The new will drastically reduced Lady Wycliffe's inheritance, leaving her a small annuity and nothing more. The bulk of the estate was to be divided between various charities, including a fund for African missions, a cause Sir Edward had supported during his earlier years. The most striking change, however, was the fact that Beatrice had been named the primary beneficiary, inheriting the family estate outright. In addition, a portion of the fortune had been designated for her personal use, securing her a comfortable future. For Eliza, the only daughter, there was no such fortune. She was left only a modest allowance, less than half of what she had been promised in the previous will. Hugh was also slighted in the new document, with his share reduced to a sum sufficient for a quiet life, but far from what he had expected. Jane could see how each of them might have been dissatisfied with the new arrangements, but something about the changes didn't sit right with her. The document was signed by Sir Edward with a flourish, but there was no indication of who had witnessed the signing. There was no date written on the final clause, just a vague mention that it was drawn up on the advice of a trusted legal advisor. The signature was fresh, but the ink showed signs of smudging, suggesting that it had been signed hastily. She flipped back to the first will and noted that it had been witnessed by both Sir Edward's solicitor, Arthur Blake, and his longtime friend, Dr. Gregory Hargrove, a name Jane had already heard mentioned in passing by Mrs. Fisher, the housekeeper. But the new will? There was no such witness. Something was very wrong here. The more Jane considered the revised will, the more she began to question its legitimacy. It seemed possible, even probable, that someone in the house had forged Sir Edward's signature. But who? And why? Before she could come to any conclusions, there was a knock at the door. Jane turned, expecting a servant with a message, but instead it was Arthur Blake, the solicitor who had drafted the will. He was a tall, thin man in his mid-40s, with sharp, calculating features and an air of impatience. "Detective Parsons, I presume," he said in a voice that was both curt and formal. Jane rose from her seat. "Yes, Mr. Blake, thank you for coming." "I understand you're investigating the tragic deaths of Sir Edward and Lady Wycliffe. I trust you have everything you need to proceed." "I'm sure you can help me with a few details, Mr. Blake," Jane said, gesturing toward the desk. "I've just been reviewing Sir Edward's most recent will, the one you drew up. I'd like to understand the circumstances behind it." Blake's smile faltered. "Of course. It was my professional duty to assist Sir Edward in making changes to his estate. His instructions were clear. The revised will reflected his wishes, and I saw no reason not to comply." Jane studied him carefully, noting the slight hesitation in his voice. "You say his wishes were clear. Did Sir Edward seem in full possession of his faculties when he made those changes? I understand he'd been feeling unwell in recent weeks." Blake's expression tightened. Sir Edward was certainly not in perfect health, but he was a man of clear mind. I have no doubt that his intentions were sound. He simply wished to make provisions for causes he believed in, most notably the African missions that had meant so much to him in his younger days. Jane nodded thoughtfully. "I see. And was anyone else present when the will was signed? I've noticed that there are no witnesses listed on the document." Blake's eyes flickered again. "Well, no, there were no witnesses to the signing. Sir Edward insisted on handling the document in private. He was not one for formalities at that stage in his life. He had already made arrangements for a solicitor's visit, but I had to leave town suddenly on another matter, and we never got around to the final formalities." "You never saw the document signed?" Jane asked. Blake shifted uncomfortably. "I did not. No. Sir Edward was adamant about keeping the matter private. I trust his judgment. And, to be quite honest, I didn't expect it to be a matter of concern. I've prepared many wills for him over the years, and I've never had any reason to doubt his decisions." "But you do acknowledge that the document was unsigned, and there were no witnesses?" Jane asked, her voice calm but firm. Blake's eyes darkened, and for the first time, Jane saw a flicker of something approaching unease. "Detective, Sir Edward was a man of great stature in this community. He was in no need of formality or additional witnesses for a document of this nature. The will reflected his wishes, and that is the only thing that matters." "Mr. Blake, I'm not questioning Sir Edward's judgment. I'm simply trying to understand the situation. What I do find concerning is that the will is dated just days before his death, and yet it was never formally witnessed. And there are inconsistencies with the signatures. Could you explain that?" Blake's face turned pale. For a long moment he said nothing. Then, with an abrupt exhale, he seemed to concede. "I can't explain it fully, Detective, but I was under duress, and Sir Edward had been in a hurry. I was involved in something else when he asked me to come by. I didn't question it. Perhaps I should have. Jane's heart quickened. Something was clearly amiss, and Blake's reluctance to answer directly only deepened her suspicions. She leaned forward slightly, her voice soft but steely. "Mr. Blake, do you know anything about a forgery? Could someone have taken advantage of Sir Edward's condition to alter the will?" Blake remained silent for several moments. When he finally spoke, his voice was little more than a whisper. "I'm afraid I don't know. But it's possible. I don't know how it happened, but I wouldn't put it past someone close to Sir Edward." His eyes darted toward the door. Jane nodded slowly. It was clear now. The will had been forged. And someone in this house, someone close to Sir Edward, was behind it. Chapter 4. The Unseen Hand. The air in Larkspur House had thickened with suspicion. The forged will was a key element, but it was only one piece of a much larger puzzle. Jane's growing sense that the circumstances surrounding Sir Edward and Lady Wycliffe's deaths were not merely tragic accidents, nor crimes of passion, led her back to a fundamental truth of detective work. Everything was connected. Her interview with solicitor Arthur Blake had left her unsettled. His evasiveness, the way he shifted uncomfortably when pressed about the document's lack of witnesses, told Jane that there was something he was hiding. But the solicitor was not her only concern. The rest of the household, Beatrice, Hugh, and Eliza, held their own mysteries. The next piece of the puzzle, Jane realized, might lie with Dr. Gregory Hargrove, the family physician. He had been a close friend of Sir Edward's for many years, often consulted on medical matters, and had also been a witness to the first will. The Hargrove residence was a modest yet dignified home on the outskirts of the village, nestled in a quiet cul-de-sac where the cobblestone streets were often empty. When Jane arrived, the door was opened by a young woman who introduced herself as Dr. Hargrove's niece, Sophia, a red-haired woman in her 20s with a nervous smile. "Dr. Hargrove is expecting you, Miss Parsons. He's in the study," Sophia said, stepping aside to allow Jane entry. "He's rather unwell today, I'm afraid. He's been feeling quite tired lately, though he refuses to rest properly." Jane followed Sophia down a narrow hallway and into a study that, like the rest of the house, had a calm, unpretentious air. The room smelled faintly of tobacco and ink, with shelves lined with medical texts and journals. A large desk sat in front of the window. Behind it, Dr. Gregory Hargrove sat in a well-worn leather chair, his greying hair and slightly stooped posture giving him an air of quiet wisdom. His thin face, usually composed, now appeared worn, as though the burdens of his long career had finally caught up with him. "Ah, Miss Parsons, I see you've come to speak with me," Dr. Hargrove said in his soft, measured tone. "Thank you for seeing me, Doctor," Jane replied. She studied him carefully as he arranged his papers. There was something about his demeanor today, his hesitation, the slight nervousness, that unsettled her. "So, I understand you've been attending to Sir Edward's medical needs for many years," Jane began, looking him in the eye. "Could you tell me about his condition in the weeks leading up to his death? Specifically his health at the time of his passing?" Dr. Hargrove's face tightened, and his hands shook slightly as he clasped them in his lap. Sir Edward's health had been deteriorating for some time. The heart, you see. It was always his weakest organ. For the past few months, he had been feeling more fatigued than usual, complaining of pains in his chest and an overwhelming sense of weakness. I had been treating him with tinctures and various tonics to help him manage the symptoms. "And what about the medicine he was taking?" Jane asked. "Was there anything unusual in the medications you prescribed? Any new treatments?" Dr. Hargrove stiffened slightly. "There was nothing unusual in his prescriptions, Miss Parsons. The treatments I provided were consistent with what I had given him for years. He had been on a low dose of digitalis to regulate his heart, and I prescribed some mild sedatives for his insomnia. Nothing outside the ordinary." "And these treatments, Could they have had any dangerous interactions? Jane pressed. Dr. Hargrove shifted uncomfortably in his seat. That's a very difficult question, Miss Parsons. You must understand, I've always prided myself on being meticulous in my treatments. There are always risks when you treat someone as elderly and frail as Sir Edward, but I can assure you that I've never administered anything that could harm him. Did Sir Edward ever mention feeling unwell after taking any particular medicine? She asked. Perhaps after one of his prescriptions. Was there ever any indication that he might have been poisoned? Dr. Hargrove froze. The blood drained from his face, and for a long moment he said nothing. Jane's eyes locked onto his, watching him carefully. There was no doubt in her mind. He knew something. He was holding back. Poisoned? Dr. Hargrove repeated, his voice shaky. What makes you ask that? Jane's gaze softened, but her voice remained firm. I'm not making any accusations, Doctor. I simply want to understand the full picture. Sir Edward's death was sudden and unexpected. We believe he was poisoned, and I must ask everyone who had access to his medications. Dr. Hargrove swallowed hard, his hand trembling as he reached for a glass of water on the side table. Poisoned? He repeated again. I can't believe it. I treated Sir Edward with the utmost care. It's not possible. Jane leaned forward slightly. Doctor, if Sir Edward was poisoned, do you know of any substances that might have been used? Something rare? Something that might have been obtained recently? The pause that followed was long and tense. When Dr. Hargrove finally spoke, his voice was barely a whisper. There was one thing that I might have overlooked. A few weeks ago, Sir Edward became quite obsessed with the idea of a rare substance. A poison, really. He had read about it in some old medical journals, something called curare. He was fascinated by its effects. He asked me if I knew anything about it. I told him it was incredibly dangerous, only used in certain parts of Africa, and it was hardly something to be concerned about in England. Curare? Jane's voice was barely a whisper. It was the same poison she had suspected from the beginning. She had assumed it was a rare weapon, something only a few would even consider, let alone know how to acquire. But Sir Edward, had he sought it out himself? Yes, curare, Dr. Hargrove confirmed. I told him that there was no need for him to worry about such things. It was a poison, and very difficult to obtain, especially in this country. I assumed it was just a passing curiosity. But Sir Edward kept asking, kept bringing it up. He seemed to think there was something to it, something about its effects, its ability to paralyze, its sudden onset. I didn't know what to make of it. It was almost as if he wanted to understand it, to feel it for himself. Jane's heart skipped a beat. She sat back in her chair, trying to absorb the weight of his words. And did Sir Edward ever acquire any of it? Dr. Hargrove's face went pale again, and he glanced nervously at Sophia, who had entered the room to bring them tea. The moment the door closed behind her, he spoke in a hushed voice. I don't know. I don't know if he ever got any, he said quickly, his voice rising in pitch. But I have heard that people with the right connections, or the right interests, can find such things. And Sir Edward had more than his fair share of acquaintances in Africa. He might have been able to acquire it, but I can't say for certain. Jane's mind was racing. Curare. It was the perfect weapon, swift and silent with no telltale signs. It fit the circumstances of the deaths of Sir Edward and Lady Wycliffe perfectly. But who had administered it? Was it an accident or a deliberate act of murder? One thing was clear. Someone in this house had known about curare, and someone had used it to kill. But who? Thank you, Doctor, Jane said, her voice steady. You've been very helpful. I may need to speak with you again, but for now, I'll take my leave. Dr. Hargrove nodded, visibly relieved. Of course, Miss Parsons. I'll be happy to assist you in any way I can. As Jane left the Hargrove residence, her thoughts were a whirlwind. She had learned much today, perhaps more than she had expected, but the trail was still cold. The poison, the forged will, the simmering tensions in the Wycliffe family. All of these threads were connected, but in what way? Jane Parsons felt the weight of the mystery pressing in on her. The answers were there, hidden in plain sight, but she needed to uncover them before the killer struck again. Chapter 5, The Fractured Family. The revelations from Jane's meeting with Dr. Gregory Hargrove had unsettled her further. The mention of curare, a potent and rare poison known to be used by tribes in the depths of Africa, was no coincidence. Sir Edward's curiosity about it had shifted the investigation onto a new, more sinister track. It was now clear that this wasn't a straightforward case of a natural death or even a simple inheritance dispute. There was a deeper, more calculating hand at work here, one that had carefully planned the deaths of Sir Edward and Lady Wycliffe. The question remained, who in this house knew about curare, and who had the means and the motive to use it? As Jane approached Larkspur House, she could see Beatrice Wycliffe standing at the window of the drawing room. Her posture was rigid, her face a mask of grief, but her eyes betrayed something else. It was an emotion Jane had seen many times before. Fear. Fear of what, exactly, was still unclear, but Jane had learned to trust her instincts. Something about Beatrice, something about the way she held herself, made Jane wary. Inside, the atmosphere at Larkspur House was charged with tension. The servants moved silently through the halls, as though aware of the undercurrent of suspicion that had taken root in the household. It had been several days since the deaths, and the family had settled into an uneasy quiet, their grief heavy but unspoken. Now, as Jane entered the drawing room, she found Beatrice standing by the fire, her back turned to the door. Her thin, graceful hands were clasped tightly together, her fingers almost white with tension. "Ah, Miss Parsons," Beatrice said, turning slowly at the sound of Jane's entrance. Her voice was calm. "I trust you've made some progress in your investigation." "Not as much as I would like," Jane replied, her voice measured, her eyes scanning the room. It was an elegant space, filled with antique furniture and delicate china. A faint scent of lavender lingered in the air, but despite its beauty, the room felt cold. "I've been speaking to Dr. Hargrove, and I've learned something rather disturbing." Beatrice raised an eyebrow, her expression carefully neutral. "Disturbing? What exactly do you mean?" Sir Edward had become rather interested in a poison called curare. "Have you heard of it?" Jane asked, her gaze fixed on Beatrice's face. The mention of the poison caused Beatrice's eyes to widen for just a moment, and then the mask returned, cool and controlled. "Curare?" "Yes, I've heard of it. It's a poison used in Africa, isn't it?" "That's exactly the question I'm trying to answer," Jane said, her voice steady. Dr. Hargrove mentioned that Sir Edward had been reading about curare shortly before his death. In fact, it seems he became quite fascinated by it. Do you know why? Beatrice hesitated for a fraction of a second too long before answering. "I don't know, Miss Parsons. It sounds rather outlandish to me." Jane nodded, though her mind was not convinced. "I see," Jane said. "Well, I'm sure the circumstances of Sir Edward's death will become clearer in time." Beatrice's lips curled into a tight smile, though her eyes remained wary. "I hope so, Miss Parsons. I truly do." It was time to speak with Hugh Wycliffe again. The study where Jane found Hugh was lined with bookshelves, the thick volumes of legal tomes and family history standing like silent sentinels. The air in the room was thick with smoke from a pipe Hugh had been smoking, and he looked far more disheveled than the last time Jane had seen him. His clothes were wrinkled, his face drawn with exhaustion, and his eyes bloodshot as if he had been losing sleep. There was a certain restlessness about him. His fingers drummed absently on the edge of the desk as Jane entered. "Miss Parsons," Hugh said, pushing his chair back from the desk, "I suppose you've come to ask me about my father's death again. You must be getting tired of the same answers." "Not at all, Mr. Wycliffe," Jane said, her voice measured. She noted the way Hugh's jaw tightened at the mention of his father. His emotions, anger, regret, something deeper, were barely contained. "I've come to ask you about something more specific, the will for one, and also the matter of curare." At the mention of the poison, Hugh's face darkened. "Curare?" He paused, clearly caught off guard. "I don't know anything about that. I certainly don't know why you'd be asking about it now." "Dr. Hargrove said Sir Edward had become interested in it in the last few weeks of his life," Jane said. "Did you know that? Did your father ever mention it to you?" Hugh shook his head sharply, his face flushed with irritation. "I don't recall him ever bringing up anything about curare. It's ridiculous, really. A man who's preoccupied with his own death and the state of his affairs isn't likely to dabble in matters of poison." Jane leaned forward, watching him closely. His defensiveness was almost too quick, too extreme. "But you knew about the changes in his will?" Hugh's eyes flared with sudden intensity. "I knew there were changes," he said, his voice low and controlled. "But I didn't think much of it. My father always had a habit of leaving everything to charity. I expected something similar." "And when you found out that your inheritance was reduced, did that make you angry?" Jane asked, her voice quiet but probing. Hugh's eyes flickered to the floor before meeting hers again. "Angry? I was disappointed, yes. But that's not the same thing. My father and I never got along perfectly. But he was still my father. I wanted to see him happy in his final days." Jane could see the strain in his posture, the way his hands clenched into fists by his sides. There was more to this than he was saying. His bitterness toward the will changes was palpable, but Jane knew there was something deeper, a motivation that wasn't being aired. "Mr. Wycliffe, if Sir Edward had been poisoned, would anyone in this house have had the means to administer it?" she asked, watching his reaction carefully. Hugh didn't answer immediately. He looked away, his eyes momentarily unfocused, and then, almost reluctantly, he muttered, "I suppose anyone who had access to his medicines might have had the opportunity, but that's a ridiculous theory. My father was always careful about what he took. And anyway, I don't know why anyone would go to such lengths." "And the will?" Jane pressed. "Do you think it was forged?" Hugh's jaw tightened once more. "I don't know, but it's possible. My father was of sound mind, but he was also very stubborn. He was convinced that charity was the only thing that mattered in the end. Maybe someone took advantage of that. The Wycliffe family was fractured, emotionally, financially, and perhaps even morally. Each one of them, in their own way, had something to hide. And in the midst of their struggles, someone had planned 2 murders with chilling precision. But who? And why? "I'll leave you to your thoughts, Mr. Wycliffe," Jane said, her tone curt. "But I must warn you, if anyone in this house is hiding something, they will be found out." As Jane left the study, she felt no closer to a solution, but the darkness surrounding the Wycliffe family was growing clearer. Each of them had their secrets, and each one had a reason to want Sir Edward dead. Chapter 6. The Hand That Moves the Pieces. The evening air was heavy with the promise of rain as Jane Parsons made her way down the long, dimly lit corridor of Larkspur House. The mansion, still in mourning from the sudden deaths of Sir Edward and Lady Wycliffe, felt more like a mausoleum than a home. The distant clatter of dinner plates echoed faintly from the dining room, but otherwise, the household was eerily quiet. She had spoken to Beatrice and Hugh Wycliffe at length, but the more she learned, the more the shadows of doubt grew. Each family member seemed to be hiding something, and their conflicting stories only deepened the mystery surrounding the deaths. Beatrice, the composed widow, had been a study in restraint, her emotions tightly controlled. She had denied any knowledge of the curare or the possibility of foul play. But Jane's instincts told her otherwise. There was a chill about Beatrice that went beyond grief. Hugh, meanwhile, had been more open but equally defensive. His bitterness toward his father's will was palpable, but his response to the suggestion of poison had been quick to dismiss, almost too quick. Then there was the matter of Eliza, Sir Edward's younger sister, who had arrived at Larkspur House shortly after the deaths. Eliza had been relatively quiet since her arrival, and Jane had yet to speak to her directly. But something about the woman, her silence, her withdrawn demeanor, told Jane that she might be the key to unraveling the final pieces of the puzzle. That evening, Jane found herself standing in front of the large oak door to Eliza Whitcliffe's room. She had learned that Eliza had once been very close to Sir Edward, even more so than Beatrice or Hugh, but her relationship with the family had grown distant in recent years. She had been living abroad for some time before returning after the deaths. It was odd, Jane thought, that Eliza had chosen to return now, after Sir Edward's sudden death, and yet her arrival had been marked by nothing more than whispered greetings and uneasy glances. Jane knocked lightly, and the door opened almost immediately. Eliza stood in the doorway, dressed in a simple gown of black mourning, her delicate face framed by loose greying hair. She was pale, almost gaunt-looking, her features drawn with fatigue, but there was something in her eyes, something sharp and intelligent, that reminded Jane of the Sir Edward she had heard about in conversations, the man who, despite his many eccentricities, had kept a sharp mind until the end. "Miss Parsons," Eliza said, her voice soft but clear. "I was expecting you. Please, come in." Jane nodded, stepping into the room. It was a modest space, the furniture simple yet elegant, and there was a faint smell of lavender in the air. Unlike the rest of the house, which felt cold and oppressive, Eliza's room had a quiet warmth to it. "Thank you for seeing me, Mrs. Whitcliffe," Jane said, choosing her words carefully. "I wanted to speak to you about Sir Edward. I understand you were very close in the past." Eliza's gaze softened, and for a moment, Jane saw a flicker of something, grief perhaps, behind her eyes. But it was gone in an instant, replaced by the calm composure Eliza had maintained since her arrival. "We were," Eliza said quietly, "but things changed. He became more distant, but we still spoke often. We still wrote." "And in the weeks leading up to his death," Jane asked, watching Eliza closely, "did he seem unusual in any way? Did he mention anything about his health or any concerns he had?" Eliza's brow furrowed slightly as she thought. "He had been feeling ill for some time, yes. I knew he wasn't well, but he always downplayed it. He never wanted to talk about it. He was stubborn, you see, always in control. But I did notice something strange. He became more withdrawn, even more preoccupied with studies. I thought it was just his usual eccentricities. But now, after what's happened, I wonder if it was something else." Jane leaned forward slightly, her interest piqued. "What do you mean? What studies?" Eliza hesitated, her fingers twitching slightly as she reached for the edge of a book on her bedside table. "He was studying poisons. And not just any poisons. Curare, specifically. I found several books on the subject in his library. I didn't think much of it at the time. My father always had strange fancies, as I said. But now, after hearing you mention curare, I wonder if it's connected." Jane's pulse quickened. He was studying curare. "Do you think he might have been researching it for some reason?" Eliza's eyes darkened. "I don't know. He never told me much, but he was always fascinated with death, how people died, what killed them, how quickly it happened. He was obsessed with it in the last few months. But, you see, it was more than just curiosity. It was as if he was trying to understand something that frightened him." Jane sat back in her chair, her mind racing. "Did he ever tell you where he had learned about curare? Did he mention anyone in particular?" Eliza hesitated. "No, but he did talk about someone who had sent him a letter, a man he'd known in Africa, a former acquaintance of his from his younger days. He mentioned the man's name, Benoit. But I don't know who he was. He didn't say much else." Jane felt a sudden, sharp spark of recognition. Benoit. The name rang a distant bell in her memory, but she couldn't place it. She would need to look into it later. But for now, the pieces were starting to come together. Sir Edward had been researching curare, and he had an old acquaintance who could have been involved in its acquisition. Perhaps the poison had been sent to him by this man, someone from his past. "Did you ever discuss his will with him?" Jane asked, shifting topics. "I understand he had made some recent changes." Eliza's face tightened at the mention of the will. "He never shared the details with me, but I know he was planning to change it. He said he wanted to leave something to charity, but I don't know what he was thinking. The Wycliffe estate, it was always a burden to him. He hated the idea of it being passed down through generations. He wanted to do something good with it before he died." Jane nodded slowly, processing Eliza's words. "And do you think the will was changed before or after Sir Edward's death?" Eliza's gaze drifted to the fire, her expression distant. "I don't know. I haven't seen the will myself, but I have my suspicions. I think it was changed after he became ill, after he began to withdraw from everyone, including me." Jane was silent for a moment, considering what Eliza had said. There were more questions now than answers, but the fabric of the mystery was beginning to weave itself together. Sir Edward's obsession with curare, the mysterious letter from Benoit, the forged will, and the fractures within the family, each piece of the puzzle was beginning to connect. "I appreciate your honesty," Jane said after a long pause. "Your information has been very helpful." Eliza smiled faintly, though her eyes remained clouded with sorrow. "I only wish I could tell you more. I never understood all of his motives." As Jane stood to leave, she couldn't shake the feeling that she had just uncovered something far more dangerous than she had anticipated. Sir Edward's death had been no accident, and the web of lies, motives, and old wounds was more tangled than ever. The key to the mystery lay in the shadows of the past, and only by bringing those shadows into the light would Jane be able to find the truth. Chapter 7. The Poisoned Truth. The rain began in earnest as Jane stood in the front hall of Larkspur House, staring at the heavy oak door before her. Her investigation into the deaths of Sir Edward and Lady Wycliffe had grown more complex with each passing day, and though she had uncovered many pieces of the puzzle, the most crucial part remained frustratingly elusive. The mention of curare, Sir Edward's obsession with it, the mysterious letter from Benoit, the strange behaviour of the family, and the forged will, all these elements were part of a larger whole, but it wasn't yet clear how they fit together. As she waited for the storm to subside, her thoughts turned back to her meeting with Eliza Wycliffe in the drawing room earlier that day. Eliza had provided an important lead. Sir Edward had been in contact with someone named Benoit, a man from his past in Africa, who may have played a role in supplying the curare. The letter, that was the key. Benoit. Jane made her way back to the library, where she had spent much of her time poring over Sir Edward's papers. His obsession with poisons, particularly curare, had been well documented in his journals and books. But now she had a more pressing concern: the letter from Benoit, and it might provide the final link to understanding the motive behind the murders. The only sound in the library was the crackling of the fire in the hearth, and the steady rhythm of the rain against the windows. Jane walked up to the large oak desk in the centre of the room and began to sift through the papers strewn across its surface. And then Jane found it, a folded sheet of paper, written in a hurried, almost frantic hand. The letter from Benoit. She unfolded it carefully, her eyes scanning the page. The writing was slanted and irregular, as if the sender had been in a hurry. "My dear Edward, I trust this finds you well. I am sorry to hear of your declining health. It pains me to know that you are struggling. But you are right, the studies of curare are both fascinating and terrifying. I have sent you a small quantity of the poison, as promised. Be cautious with it. Its effects are swift and deadly. It will serve your research well, but do not underestimate its power. I look forward to hearing from you soon, and hope to see you before too long. Yours, Benoit." It was clear now that Sir Edward had indeed been in contact with someone who had provided him with curare. But what was the purpose of his research? Had Sir Edward intended to use the poison for his own experiments, or was there something darker at play? And had Benoit been aware of how the poison would be used, perhaps by someone else. Just then, the sound of footsteps in the hallway interrupted her thoughts. Jane quickly folded the letter and tucked it into her pocket, stepping back from the desk. She had expected to be alone, but it seemed she was not. The door to the library creaked open, and Beatrice Wycliffe entered, her face pale, her expression unreadable. She was still in her morning attire, though it looked as though she had been pacing the halls for hours. "Miss Parsons," Beatrice said in a soft, almost resigned voice, "I was hoping to speak with you." Jane straightened, her posture alert but calm. She gestured to a chair across from her. Beatrice moved toward the chair, but instead of sitting, she stood near the fireplace, her back to Jane as she stared into the flames. "I've been thinking," she said slowly, "about what you said to Hugh the other day, about the will, about curare, and I realize now that I might not have been entirely forthcoming with you." Beatrice's words were measured, but there was an edge to her voice. Something in her tone suggested she was about to reveal something important, even if it was a truth she had been reluctant to share. "What do you mean?" Jane asked carefully, studying Beatrice's posture. Beatrice turned to face Jane, her eyes now locked on the detective's. "I didn't tell you everything, about the will, and about my relationship with Edward." She paused, taking a breath as though weighing her next words. "You see, my husband and I, we were never truly happy. But after he died, I was not allowed to leave the Wycliffe estate. The marriage was arranged, family duty, you know. But after years of being unhappy and trapped, I turned to someone else." Jane's eyebrows furrowed, but she said nothing, letting Beatrice continue. "It was Benoit, Miss Parsons," Beatrice confessed, her voice dropping lower, almost as though she were afraid of being overheard. "He came to me after Sir Edward became obsessed with curare. He had worked with Edward in Africa many years ago, and when Edward started his research, Benoit reached out. He offered to help, to send him the poison. But in return, he wanted something from me." Jane's heart skipped a beat. She hadn't anticipated this. "What did he want from you?" Beatrice's face twisted with a mixture of shame and anger. "He wanted me. He wanted me to take all the money and go away to Africa with him. And at first, I entertained the idea. Benoit was charismatic, persuasive. But when I refused, he became more insistent. He began to threaten me, saying that if I didn't comply, he would expose our affair. And worse, he said he would ruin Sir Edward, take everything from him. I didn't believe him at first, but now I wonder if he meant it." Jane absorbed this revelation carefully. Beatrice had been caught in a dangerous game of manipulation, one in which she had never been the true player. The idea of an affair, of blackmail, of Benoit's threat to destroy Edward, these were all things Jane had not anticipated. But they made sense now, in a way. Beatrice had been a vulnerable target, and Benoit had used her weakness to his advantage. But where did that leave her? Was she complicit in the deaths, or was she merely another victim of Benoit's ruthless scheming? "Did you ever speak to Sir Edward about Benoit?" Jane asked, her voice steady, though she could feel the tension in the air between them. Beatrice shook her head. "No, by the time Sir Edward became obsessed with curare, I had ended the affair. But I did know something was wrong, and when I learned of the deaths, I wondered if Benoit had somehow orchestrated it. He knew about curare, he had the poison, and he knew how to use it." Jane stood, her thoughts racing. The pieces were starting to fit together, but there was still something missing, a crucial detail that needed to be uncovered. Beatrice looked at her, a weary sadness in her eyes. "I understand. Just please, be careful. Benoit is dangerous. He won't stop until he gets what he wants." Jane gave a small nod, and as Beatrice turned to leave, she took a deep breath. Benoit was at the heart of this case, a man who had used blackmail, poison, and manipulation to achieve his goals. But there was still one final piece of the puzzle to find, the true identity of the murderer. Was it Benoit himself, or was there someone else in the Wycliffe household who had taken matters into their own hands. The storm raged outside, but inside, Jane knew the truth was within her grasp. It was only a matter of time before she uncovered it. She headed to see Inspector Collins with this newfound information. Chapter 8, at the police station. "Miss Parsons," Inspector Collins said, "I was just about to go to Larkspur House." He pointed to a memo and a warrant in his hand. "The man Benoit has been on the Scotland Yard's radar for quite some time now. He smuggles and supplies exotic poisons to rich and sometimes questionable folks in England." "Yes, that is what I have come to tell you about, Inspector," Jane said. Inspector Collins smiled. "Benoit was intercepted by the Scotland Yard late last night. He was trying to get on a ship to Africa." "And the warrant?" Jane asked. "That is for Beatrice Wycliffe. Benoit has mentioned her name in his confession, and the Yard wants to bring her in for questioning. He said that the whole thing was her plan, that the majority of the money in the new forged will, which was going to go to a charity in Africa, was actually a fake made-up entity, and the money would have gone straight in his hands. He said Beatrice was going to go to Africa in a month or two, when things would calm down and they were going to live off that money. Want to accompany us to the Larkspur House, miss?" "Parsons?" Collins inquired. "No, Inspector, my work here is done," Jane said. "I think I shall head back to London this evening."